Welcome back, everybody, in the fading, gloomy twilight that is today and what I have left of my natural light. I'm reviewing another, wait, it's not a Gothic novel this time, but it is a book of philosophy that heavily influenced the Gothic genre. And it's by the founder of conservatism. So get ready for a wild ride. It is not the title that's on the cover of the book. The title of the cover of the book says, A Philosophical Enquiry into the Sublime and Beautiful by Edmund Burke. That's not the title of this book. In fact, the actual title is A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origins of Our Ideas of the Sublime and the Beautiful. So actually in the book, Edmund Burke says that it is not a philosophical inquiry into the sublime and beautiful. It's only limited in scope to being a philosophical inquiry into the origin of our ideas of the sublime and the beautiful. So this book has been mentioned in the introduction and in some of the notes to a lot of the books that I've read in my review of Gothic novels. And the reason is that this book, and especially its ideas about the sublime, were very influential into the development of the early Gothic genre, including into the works of Anne Radcliffe that I'm getting more into, but even before that, but especially through Radcliffe and then into the later authors. So this book is actually from the 1850s, so it predates the Gothic genre entirely. And you may have heard of Edmund Burke, and the reason that you might have heard of Edmund Burke is because of another book he wrote, Reflections on the Revolution in France, which is considered like an all-time great of political science and is kind of a founding like manifesto some people put to conservatism. In fact, Edmund Burke is kind of considered the founder of modern conservatism, even though he would have been considered like a liberal in his own time and was a member of the Whig Party. He is the origin of a lot of sources of what we would consider conservatism now, because most mainstream conservatism for the last 200 years has actually been a form of liberalism, and Americans don't use words right. What we would consider conservatives in America up until extremely recently would actually just be considered like a branch of liberalism, in the same way that in Germany you wouldn't consider that the Christian Democrats were not somehow part of the like liberal tradition. They would be like just a type of that, versus like, let's say, an SR or an SD that would be social democrats or social revolutionaries. That would kind of be a break from liberal ideology. Here we use liberals to mean leftists, which kind of confuses the whole idea, and it also kind of skews Americans' ideas about where Edmund Burke actually stood. But all of that happened much later. This book was written in the 1850s, and Reflections on the Revolution in France was not written until 3 decades later. So focusing on this book, it's actually really interesting to see where Edmund Burke stood as a philosopher as a young man. And once again, we have a guy who is young and writing some major breaking work. And he was also influenced by a lot of other writers about the field of aesthetics. So today we think of aesthetics as kind of being like all about art. And to some degree, they considered it to be about art too, but they also considered it to just be about a type of philosophy akin to nature, to human nature, and to art, and also to like literature and music. Like aesthetics could be all of those things. And once again, aesthetics is another word that we are totally abusing in modern times. Like now it just means like a type of like filter that you put on something, versus an actual philosophy about why something is, like why something is beautiful, like the ideas behind beauty, the ideas behind the reactions that we have to art. And so we've kind of disassociated aesthetics with the philosophical meaning of the word. So going to Burke, he brings up two major themes in this. One is beauty, and one is the sublime. And the difference that he draws is that like he connects beauty to like creativity and to like procreation. So essentially it's like what we are attracted to. And then he puts that as one of the major facets of life versus terror or a fear of death, which he associates with the sublime and the reaction that we get of the sublime. So thus, like, there's nothing more beautiful from a male point of view than a beautiful woman, and there's nothing more sublime than something which puts the fear of death into you, but does so like at a level removed. So the level removed would be that like you have a sense of terror, but that sense of terror is not like an overwhelming sense of terror like that you're directly going to be destroyed, because then it wouldn't be sublime. But to see that and to be like one step removed from it is what causes the sublime effect in your mind. So an example of this, like when he talks about vastness, you know, like a massive cliff or like the Grand Canyon, we would consider like standing there a sublime experience. We would feel the sublime greatly. And if you look at the descriptions and the landscape and the way that things are painted by somebody like Anne Radcliffe in her novels, she was totally taking the ideas that Burke had about the sublime and putting them into the landscapes that the characters encountered in her novels, and that her characters were basically feeling these effects of the sublime. They also are often like horrified and terrified, and they encounter things that can be interpreted as supernatural. And these things have a sublime effect because we're able to live this mortal terror, but like one step removed so we can reflect on it. And this introduces into the character like the feeling of the sublime, and also into the reader the feeling of the sublime. And this was also replicated through like the picturesque. Like you would have like nature, which would be sublime, and a painter would try to capture that nature, and then his captured nature would be a reflection of the sublime, but it would never be as great as the actual thing in nature. A thunderstorm is another example of the sublime, because the power imbued in the storm is just like beyond you. It's a massive force that you can do nothing about. It's this pure force of nature that you're encountered with, that you realize could totally overwhelm you, but you find your house and you're safe in your house, and you can still feel the effects of the sublime. I thought that the parts of the book which were about the nature of the sublime and about the nature of terror and kind of abstract or one step removed terror, especially the ultimate terror is the terror of death, that it's kind of like this blinding fear that operates in the human mind, and that it basically almost like gives us like a sense of God, to see our own existence threatened. I thought that was really interesting. I thought that his ideas about beauty were less interesting because, one, I think that it was more subjective, and he was trying to limit himself to what he believed to be objectively true, in that like he would take the idea of preference out of something and he would try to find like universal values to something. Pretty interesting is that he talked about the aesthetics of taste, like not just taste, like taste for fashion, which he actually said is not that influenced by aesthetics because it can change, but like literal like taste. Like he would say like, you know, basically sweetness in taste is like beauty. But you could prefer not to have something sweet, and then you would still know that the sweet thing is like the beautiful flavor in some ways. Like for example, like, you know, you could know that something is really sweet and like that's like a positive like pleasure. But like you could prefer something bitter because your palate could be adjusted to that. And you might really like, let's say unsweetened coffee. It's not sweet, so you would think that it's not like taste-wise aesthetically pleasing, but you might actually prefer that. But you would always know that like sugar would be sweet and that coffee would be bitter. You would always know that. You would just say, well, I prefer this thing, but you wouldn't prefer it as like, well, universally this tastes better. You would know that like sugar would be like a universally this tastes better thing. But that wouldn't affect your enjoyment of coffee, and it also wouldn't affect your understanding of the aesthetic of it, I guess. I found that really interesting, and I found it kind of more interesting than like his ideas of visual beauty, because a lot of them, which made sense, and he used a lot of principles about texture, about light, about this, about that. They were interesting, but I kind of felt that like he might have come to different conclusions if he had had like modern neuroscience on his side. And so he kind of says like, well, things are certain ways and we will never be able to break it down further than that. It's like, okay, yes, but I'm reading it from a time period when we kind of have broken down some of the factors further than that, down into like neurological reasons why things happen the way they do in our minds and in our optic nerves and such and such. And his explanations, some of them just don't correlate to science today, which doesn't take away from the kind of genius of his philosophical thinking, but it does kind of long for one to see like what he would have thought if he had been endowed with more knowledge about, like, let's say, how the nervous system works, because he comments on it quite a bit about like the optic nerves and the taste buds and things like that and how they're reacting to our mind. So it would have been really interesting to see what his thoughts on beauty would be if he could see a lot of like neurological research and have more understanding about how the mind worked, or about how the brain and the nervous system worked, that they did not have in, let's say, 1750s when he was writing this book. I really enjoyed the book, and I would say that anybody who has an interest in the 1700s, in aesthetics, in art, in the Gothic, in philosophy, in the foundation of conservatism, would really enjoy this book. It was a quick read, and the sections, I should say, are broken down into tiny little things. Like, see here, we have part 1, section 15, the effects of tragedy. Part 1, section 16, imitation, and it goes on for only like a page or two, sometimes a paragraph, sometimes several pages. But the issues, he talks very directly to them, and he breaks down exactly what he's talking about and makes one section for that. Sometimes refers to things later in his general theme, but really breaks it down into each individual thing that he's talking about the aesthetic of. So I found that really well organized, really pleasing, and it's also very limited in the scope. So I think he didn't want to bring a lot of criticism onto himself, so he only went with how he really felt certain aspects of our understanding of reality could be described. And as I said, he only wanted to talk about the origins of our ideas and not into like the kind of final conclusions on the nature of these things. So I think that he helped himself out by limiting himself in scale and in what he was describing. So anybody that, would have fun reading any kind of philosophical text like this, it's really fun, it's really enjoyable, and I really did spend quite a few days, like every time I would pick something up or look at something, or look at someone across the street, or bite into an apple or something, I would think like, oh, look at the curvature of this apple, like, oh, but what about the way that, is this affecting my nerves, and why do I think that this is preferable to this? I really was kind of affected by it. So it was a lot of fun in that way, because it's a lot of fun to read this book and then think about the ideas afterwards. It's fun philosophy, because everything that you do go see, touch after you read this, you can kind of think back to how Burke was describing our reactions to nature and to experience. So it was a lot of fun. It was a nice little departure from my constant stream of Gothic novels. And I do have Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France on my reading list, and I actually have a copy right here. So sometime in the near future, maybe after the election or around election time, I will dig into that. But thanks for watching, guys. Like, subscribe, all that stuff if you're not already. And there'll be more political science, more philosophy, and lots more Gothic novels with spooky castles and some Sublime thunderstorms and crazy things like that coming up soon. Thanks for watching, guys. Take care of yourselves. Bye.